Attention all grill masters and backyard barbecue enthusiasts. Lynn's has everything you need to make your 4th of July cookout a success. From sizzling certified Angus beef steaks and mouth-watering burgers to fresh-cut fruit and all the condiments you desire, we have you covered. Browse our weekly ad for celebratory savings like 39 cents per pound seedless watermelon through July 4th and shop online at lynsgrocery.com for extra convenience. Lynn's, where delicious begins.
This episode was first published on June 25th, 2024. Palestinians and the rules-based order.
General Assembly of the United Nations has made its decision on Palestine.
Soviet Union, yes. United Kingdom, abstain. The United States, yes.
If they hadn't got all they wanted, they had at least gained the verdict for the setting up of a new Jewish state.
Arab opposition to the partition scheme has been violent. The call for a holy war against the Jews went out from Kattan.
لقد عرفنا فيكم الإخلاص والتفاني في خدمة قضايا الحرية.
Ever since Harry Truman first recognized Israel, every American president, Democrat and Republican, has worked for peace between Israel and her neighbors.
It is not fair that a Palestinian child cannot grow up in a state of their own.
At the time where the world was calling to flood Gaza with humanitarian aid and calling for a ceasefire, Israel imposed a drought. Its plan has not changed: destroy and displace.
Why is it that Palestinians are still stateless more than 75 years after the founding of a Jewish state in the same land? Why have international law and the rules-based order established after 1945 failed the Palestinian people? Why hasn't the United Nations, with its Security Council designed to prevent conflict, stopped this conflict? That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
I mean, if you were to ask great powers what's the purpose of international law or the UN system after 1945, they would say it's to preserve international peace and security amongst the great powers.
Argentina, abstention. Soviet Union, yes. United Kingdom.
Late November 1947, the UN General Assembly votes 33-13 with 10 abstentions to partition Palestine, in one of the most consequential votes the body has ever taken.
The resolution of the DUC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
As Ian Black writes in his book, Enemies and Neighbors, that September, 7 of the UN Committee's 10 members recommended partition into 2 states with international status for Jerusalem. The minority, India, Iran, and Yugoslavia, proposed a federal state with Jerusalem as its capital. The Arab Higher Committee expressed amazement and disbelief, as this was contrary to the UN Charter and to the principles of justice and integrity, it said. Britain announced that it would leave Palestine in 6 months' time if no settlement was reached. No one seriously imagined that it would be, and on 29th of November 1947, the UN General Assembly voted to partition Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. Intense Zionist lobbying, says Black, secured a majority of 33-13 with 10 abstentions, a close-run thing since a two-thirds majority was required. UN Resolution 181 was backed, crucially, by both the U.S. and the USSR, the world's great powers in the early days of the Cold War. It was opposed by the Palestinians and by Arab and Muslim states infuriated by American susceptibility to the Zionists, Black writes. The proposed Jewish state was to consist of 55% of the country, including the largely unpopulated Negev Desert. Its population would comprise some 500,000 Jews and 400,000 Arabs, a very substantial minority. Jews at that point owned just 7% of Palestine's private land. The Arab state was to have 44% of the land and a minority of 10,000 Jews. Greater Jerusalem was to remain under international rule. The Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini, declared the UN vote null and void. Jamal al-Husseini, vice president of the Arab Higher Committee, had already warned that it was the sacred duty of the Arabs of Palestine to defend their country against all aggression. Now he rejected the proposed border as a line of blood and fire. The Palestinian view was that partition did not involve a compromise but was Zionist in conception and tailored to meet Zionist needs and demands. Arab anger was matched by Jewish jubilation, writes Ian Black.
And this was the scene next day in Jerusalem. The Jewish people at once began to celebrate the United Nations decision. If they hadn't got all they wanted, they had at least gained the verdict for the setting up of a new Jewish state, and their rejoicing was obviously a spontaneous affair.
And so continued a conflict that originated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries when European Jews began emigrating to Palestine. One that has continued to this day, with Palestinians as far from achieving statehood now as at any time since that partition vote in 1947, a vote they rejected. International law after 1945 and the United Nations were established to prevent armed conflict, to encourage the peaceful resolution of disputes, to protect civilians from the horrors of war and genocide, based on the sanctity of international borders and the universal right of self-determination for all people. Well, as we know, there have been plenty of wars and war crimes since 1945, although not another world war. But over the past 75-plus years, the rules-based order, or better yet, the great powers that decide when and to whom the rules apply, has not liberated Palestinians. They have no state. They live under military occupation in the West Bank and under land, sea, and air blockade in Gaza, where for the better part of the past 2 decades, the terrorist group Hamas has held power. It was Hamas that provoked the current war by slaughtering more than 1,200 Israelis on October 7, 2023. And since that day 8 months ago, I've produced a bunch of episodes about the origins of this conflict and about attempts to resolve it, such as the Oslo Accords held by President Clinton on the White House lawn in 1993.
Ever since Harry Truman first recognized Israel, every American president, Democrat and Republican, has worked for peace between Israel and her neighbors. Now the efforts of all who have labored before us bring us to this moment, a moment when we dare to pledge what for so long seemed difficult even to imagine, that the security of the Israeli people will be reconciled with the hopes of the Palestinian people, and there will be more security and more hope for all.
So I got the idea for this episode by listening to a competitor's podcast, The Ezra Klein Show at the New York Times. He interviewed Yale's Asli Bali about international law and the United Nations. It reminded me of something one of my guests said to me in an episode I did about the UN in 2022. The UN is only as good as its members. The UN is its members, and since World War II, its most important body, the Security Council, has been dominated by a country, the United States, that opposes resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict via a Security Council resolution. So last month, when the General Assembly passed a resolution saying Palestinians qualify for full member status at the UN, everyone knew immediately it had no chance at the Security Council level because of the U.S. veto, even though it passed the General Assembly by an overwhelming majority.
Those in favor of draft resolution A/ES10/L30/revision 1, please signify. Those against and abstentions.
This week, only this week, Israel commemorated Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. And it is during our sacred week that this shameless body has chosen to reward modern-day Nazis with rights and privileges. As Israelis mourn the Jewish babies burned in the crematoria, you here at the UN usher in the collaborators of the Israeli babies burned on October 7th. Do you know who controls Gaza? You probably have forgotten, because in all of your resolutions here since October 7th, you have failed to even call them out by name.
And what will happen now that they have had this vote in the General Assembly, they will get more rights and privileges. They will get to sit in the General Assembly hall in alphabetical order. They can speak about any topic now.
As we speak, 1.4 million Palestinians in Rafah wonder if they will survive today and wonder where to go next. there is nowhere left to go.
Now, the Palestinian cause has made gains at the UN over the decades, as when Yasser Arafat, head of the PLO, was invited to address the General Assembly in 1974. As of 1969, the Palestinian cause was no longer seen as simply a refugee problem by the General Assembly. It was a political problem. As it was said at the time, the problem of Palestine Arab refugees has arisen from the denial of their inalienable rights. In 1970, 71, and 72, General Assembly resolutions declared that full respect for these rights of the Palestinian people is an indispensable element in the establishment of a just and lasting peace in the Middle East. Even as early as 1948, the General Assembly affirmed the right to return for Palestinian refugees of the Nakba. The lands occupied by Israel in 1967 after the Six-Day War were deemed inadmissible by the UN repeatedly. Yet all these resolutions did not magically resolve the conflict. Victor Kattan is a professor in public international law at the University of Nottingham School of Law. His recent publications include Making Endless War, the Vietnam and Arab-Israeli Conflicts in the History of International Law. And he also edited another book recently, The Breakup of India and Palestine, The Causes and Legacies of Partition. Victor Kattan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Martin. It's a pleasure to be joining you.
Joining us from Nottingham. And you know, Victor, I am not an expert on this, so delving into international law is difficult. But I think I have a basic understanding of what it's supposed to do, right? It's supposed to protect the self-determination and the national aspirations of people. It is supposed to protect boundaries, right? We can't have revision of boundaries through conflict anymore. This is the post-1945 rules-based order. We hear those words a lot these days. But you know, in a different context, I've just been reading a book about the Cold War where the author says, states and ideologies do not decide. People decide. You know, the law is there, but the law just can't magically protect people. This isn't so much a question as more of an introduction to my meandering interview style here, Victor. But,
well, I can answer it.
Yeah.
I have something to say about what you just said.
Why don't we start there? I mean, what is the purpose of international law nowadays when we hear so much about the rules-based order?
Well, it depends on who you ask, but you mentioned states and peoples. So political ideologies and states are obviously determined by people. There's no such thing as a state without a people, and the people decide to govern a state, and they will run the state according to ideas of what they have about the purpose of running a government. So they are all interconnected. I mean, if you were to ask great powers, what's the purpose of international law or the UN system after 1945, they would say it's to preserve international peace and security amongst the great powers. There were others like the Soviets who articulated a different idea based on the sovereignty of peoples. Soviet republics prioritized national self-determination, funded revolutions in the Third World. But that wasn't the view that was obviously accepted by Washington, London, Paris, and other Western capitals. So historically, there was never one idea of what international law was. Even now, the idea of international law or what the purpose of international law is sharply divided. You mentioned the rules-based order, which is a Washington view. Other states like China and Russia ironically referred to the UN Charter, preserving state sovereignty as it was originally conceived, although they also stress anti-colonialism as well. Which is something that's downplayed by the Western powers. So we're at a moment in another divided world. The world was also divided during the Cold War. It's divided again in a different way, and we have different discourses, different understandings of what international law means.
So when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict, I've done a number of episodes that have delved deeper into history, starting in the early 20th century, even late 19th century, Zionism, etc., Balfour Declaration. I'm going to try to keep this conversation 1945 and beyond, because we are dealing with the rules that were set after the Second World War.
Yeah.
But if we go back to, say, the establishment of Israel, the partition vote by the United Nations in 1947, Israel declares its independence the following year in 1948. This was a first, wasn't it? The UN, after the British announced they're quitting the mandate, toss it to the UN, you guys handle it, we're done with this place. Were they making up the rules, or were there rules in place to try to decide how to make this one small piece of land livable in a fair way by two peoples with competing and conflicting national aspirations?
Well, there were rules. They were in the UN Charter. There's also something called customary international law, which exists alongside the UN Charter. But again, it was good that you started with the point about international order, international law. What is international law? Because in 1945, again, you had different views of what international law was. The Palestinians articulated their right to national self-determination over all of the land of what was historic Palestine, based on the fact that they were numerically preponderant and they owned most of the land. So they're not only the majority of the population, but they were the majority landowners. And according to the mandate system, I know we're starting in 1945, but you kind of need to understand the pre-system. They were an A-class mandate. They were former Ottoman, part of the Ottoman Empire, where they shared sovereignty, according to the last Ottoman constitution, with the Sultanic authority. So they had representation as deputies in the Ottoman parliament. But then during the British period, that's all removed from them, and they no longer have control or a say at all in their own affairs due to the policy of the Balfour Declaration. So by the time we reach 1945 or 1947, we have a major dispute between the indigenous Palestinian Arab population, Christian, Muslim, and other minorities, other groups, and the Jewish community, the majority of which, there were also a small Jewish community that existed in Palestine prior to the Balfour Declaration, but the majority had been encouraged to move to Palestine at that time from Europe. And as a result, this led to a conflict between the two communities as to who should be the rightful sovereign of Palestine, who should decide on the future identity of the state. And so the Brits came up with all kinds of plans. They came up with previous partition plans, and they abandoned those ideas, thought they didn't make any sense, in favor of an idea of majoritarianism, but they were inconclusive. They had different white papers saying different things. Then after World War II, they're bankrupt, morale is low, they want to form a national health service, they need money, there's an armed conflict or terrorism, you'd say. The Haganah, the Irgun, and other groups, Jewish groups, were viewed as terrorist groups by the British because they attacked British soldiers and also civilian buildings. The Brits decide, we're losing our soldiers, in this horrible, messy situation, it's time to clear out. The problem is basically becomes the UN problem. A letter is sent to the UN and they're asked to resolve the issue.
Yeah, I was just going to interject that we can talk about the law, but we also have to remember that states are born out of war as well. And the Jewish groups that you mentioned, Haganah, Irgun, there's also the Stern Gang, named after its founder or its most important, they went to war against the British. This was armed resistance against a colonial power, to borrow a term that's thrown around a lot today, to try to drive first the British out of Palestine, because the Jewish leaders soured on how the British were handling things. They actually put a quota in on immigration. So they wanted to establish a Jewish state. Problem number one, get rid of the British. But then now it is in the hands of the UN. And, the premise of this episode is to try to understand why and how international law has failed the Palestinian nation. I mean, right from the start, there were problems with the legitimacy of this UN partition vote, at least in the eyes of the Arab states. And within this question or statement, there's another question, and that is, well, who is it representing the Palestinians? What did the Arab states want? And, who gave them the right to decide? Because the these leadership councils that the British had disbanded in the 1930s, really gave the Palestinians no voice by the time 1947 rolls around. So it was up to the Arab neighbors to speak for them, right?
Yeah, so we have to remember, in 1947, most of what came to be called the Third World or the non-aligned movement, the Asia-Africa movement, were colonies, There were some countries in the Arab world that had become independent before 1947, but not that many. I think it was, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria and Lebanon becoming independent in 46, if I recall, Egypt. But they're a minority. They're not a majority in the UN General Assembly, so they don't have the voting power that they acquired later on during what we call decolonization. And so there was the issue of the legitimacy of the vote in terms of, it was still preponderantly a Western bloc of states, including Latin American.
Yeah, and the United States put a lot of pressure on Latin American states because there were two ideas, right? There was a partition plan, but there's also an idea for, I guess you would call, a binational single state. And the United States put pressure on to vote for partition.
That's right, yeah. And the Firestone Rubber Company in Liberia was going to vote against it. Then I think they either abstained or voted in favor of it. So there are all these allegations of horse trading. But to be honest, that's something that I think still happens today. Yeah. Powerful states still twist the arms of weaker states to vote for resolutions they want. So that is true. In terms of the Palestinians, you're right, they were divided. Most of the leadership had been killed or exiled to the Seychelles and other parts of the world, or had fled to Lebanon or other parts of the Arab world. Many Palestinians had been imprisoned and killed during the Arab revolt in the 1930s, so they were not in a good shape to fight. The Arab states themselves were divided. So it's always intriguing to think of Transjordan, which is now the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, that they weren't exactly opposed to partition. They reached a kind of modus vivendi. They would, of course, prefer the whole of Palestine and also had Jewish groups who wanted to expand. But the point is that the UN partition plan, the Palestinians were opposed to it for the reasons I explained, majority owners of the land, etc. But what actually happened is the plan was never actually implemented. Reasons for that are quite complex. Yeah,
why don't we get into those right now? Because a question I've not been able to get a good answer to. It's more of an indictment of my own reading comprehension skills, maybe. But, no one was really thrilled with the partition plan. The Jewish groups wanted more land, and they actually did get more land during the war that ensued. More land than they were given in the plan, in the vote. But why did the Arabs boycott it? Because that question that hangs over all of this going on today is, what if the Palestinians had simply accepted a state back in 1948? Would history have been different? And then what happened to the plan as a result? Because you said it just kind of fell away.
The plan ultimately wasn't enforced because the states who would be responsible for enforcing it, that is the permanent members of the UN Security Council, realized that they would need the Soviets to acquiesce. And they did. So the Soviets voted in favor of it along with the US, and they also happened to be the first countries to recognize Israel. The State Department and the Department of Defense, Pentagon, suddenly realized, well, people on the ground don't really want this, so there's going to be a conflict. And in order to enforce the plan or in order to enforce the peace, as they say, you need troops. And so the predictions were you needed at least 150, 180,000 troops on the ground. The Brits said, we're not going to use any of our troops. We're leaving precisely because we're tired of this conflict. And the Americans didn't want to send troops and be caught in the quagmire. And there was also, if it had gone through the UN Security Council, we may have had a situation where the Soviets also would have had to have peacekeeping troops. And of course, the Americans didn't want the Soviets to have to get close to that part at all. And so they were arguing over when they realized what implementation looked like, they got cold feet, and then they switched policy back to maintaining the UN and having a presence through a trusteeship agreement. There was a UN, actually a lot of people don't realize this. After the UN partition vote took place, because it was approved, the partition plan provided for what they called the Palestine Commission. So it was a commission that was supposed to travel to Palestine, liaise with the Jewish so-called provisional government of the Jewish state and the provisional government of the Arab state, and kind of get them to agree to have these two states, basically to do all the technical issues of creating two states. Now, the problem was, of course, the Brits said, we're not going to cooperate with this commission. So in January 1948, they forged an alternative plan. They say, we don't think it's realistic. We don't think the UN has the capacity to do what it thinks it can do. We think the Jewish groups are much stronger. And if we don't stop them, they're going to take over the West Bank. So they encouraged the King of Jordan to enter. The Arab Legion, in fact, the irony is they're already in the West Bank. So they left the West Bank in the 15th of May and then crossed it again. So they encouraged them after the Brits had left. And other Arab states then also intervened. From Egypt, came through Gaza. And they initially, well, the Jordanians at least, restricted themselves to the areas of the Arab state in the UN partition plan, but they lost land to the Jewish forces at the time, and the Egyptians did a very bad job. They went further afield and were defeated in the process, and the UN Security Council passed ceasefire resolution after ceasefire resolution until armistice agreements were concluded. It's quite interesting to superimpose the UN partition plan map with this ceasefire lines from 1949. You can see where the fighting kind of ended, and you can actually see that there was an attempt to stick to those lines. But people think, no, they wanted to go and push the Jews into the sea. Actually, that wasn't the case, and they were, for the most part, staying within the areas allotted to them in the boundaries of the partition plan. So it was almost like the Arab states and according to Avi Shlaim and others, there was an unwritten agreement. That's where Avi Shlaim is a historian of this period, to kind of enforce a partition between themselves. But of course, in the process of doing that, the Palestinian state envisaged in that plan was stillborn.
Because, as you say, the Jordanians occupied, I guess we would call it the West Bank, and the Egyptians occupied Gaza. They administered these areas, and the status quo hardens over time. Because
that's right.
During this time, again, on the topic of international law, the UN General Assembly is affirming the entitlement of the Palestinian refugees to return. It established a conciliation commission for Palestine to resolve the issues of territory, refugees, and the status of Jerusalem. May of 1949, Israel is admitted to the United Nations, but its membership was linked to its compliance with those two resolutions I mentioned, 181 and 194. But it never happened. So it amounted to nothing? Is that the right conclusion? Or?
Well, the Palestinians still make an argument that these resolutions are relevant today. The Israelis argue there's no such thing as conditional membership. Once you're a membership, that's it. But I would argue because of the way in which Israel and Palestine were supposed to be created out of this so-called sacred trust of civil, this mandate system, and the fact that they were born, if you like, through the United Nations, and those resolutions are important and have weight and should be respected. And it's kind of interesting because the Israelis reject that view, but on the other hand, they still recognize the consular core of the corpus separatum, which basically refers to all the consulate generals that still exist, by the way, in Jerusalem, and they're separate from the embassies. So the Brits, I think the Swedes, I think the Turks, I can't remember all of them, Spain, Greece, France have consulate generals accredited to the city of Jerusalem that was established in the UN partition plan, and they still have special visas that reflect that. So it's very interesting. It's not completely abandoned in practice.
The Palestinians are not the only peoples in the world who do not have a state. They're not the only nation. The Kurds, for instance, do not have a Kurdistan. But it seems this situation is unique. It's hard to compare what's happening in this part of the world to other places. For instance, the Kurds or any other group of people who doesn't have a nation state of their own. Do you agree with that? And why do you think that is? Is this unique? It certainly gets the most attention on college campuses, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason why it gets a lot of attention is, there's lots of reasons, but I think one of the main reasons is it's a terra sancta, it's a holy land. You know, even if you're not religious, you may have had a religious upbringing. You probably know where Jerusalem, Bethlehem, you probably heard of these places, Nazareth, Hebron. They're names from the Bible, the Quran, and people have an interest. And then there are diaspora groups, powerful voices in the West from both Israeli Jewish diaspora, Palestinian diaspora, and others. For all these reasons and spectacular acts of terrorism designed to capture public imagination, those are reasons why this conflict is in the news. Is it unique? I mean, some ways you want to say yes, and some ways you want to say no, because it's, colonialism, domination, discrimination, occupation is not something that's unique to the Palestinians. I suppose what is slightly different, or what makes Palestine legally or juridically distinct from other situations, is, of course, that they were originally established as a League of Nations mandate, enshrined in law with the idea that they would become self-governing at some point in time during the League of Nations, and that was never happened. And then in 1947, the UN, before they passed the resolution, said that both the Arab and Jewish communities were ready for independence. So they actually explicitly already reached that. And of course, only one side became independent, the other side hasn't. So in terms of a right to have a state, the Palestinian claim is one of the strongest there is. And I suppose that's what makes it distinct from, say, a group of a community that's being oppressed within a state that wants to break away, that could affect the territorial integrity of the state. The Israelis don't have sovereignty don't have formally title or legitimate title over all the territory they claim, and they've never had that. And that also makes the situation distinct from other cases.
So here we are 75 years later, and international law has, well, maybe it does have the solutions. It's just that powerful countries are not willing to go along with it. So I listened to a podcast, the Ezra Klein podcast that he does for the New York Times. He interviewed someone like yourself, an expert on these matters, Asli Bali. It was a fascinating discussion. They talked about the Security Council, UN Security Council, and what is its purpose? To defend the interests of the great powers? Because if a Palestinian state depends on the UN Security Council, it's never going to happen. You know, the United States says this needs to be negotiated between Israel and Palestine, or the Palestinians, not decided by the 5 or 6 most powerful countries in the world. So does the Security Council exist to prevent great power conflict, say U.S. versus China? Or is it to stop what you described as, colonialism, imperialism, domination of one powerful group against a weaker group? In this case, Israel, military occupation of the Palestinian territory since 1967.
I mean, the Security Council, I like to think of it as a pentarchy. This idea of, it's an older idea. It goes back to the Vienna Congress in Europe. This idea that the great powers, the winners, the victors of the Second World War, there's a hierarchy, if you like, and they're at the top, and they have greater powers and greater say in world affairs. And in the enforcement, not the making of international law, because all states are sovereign and equal, but in the enforcement of international law. And they're trying to avoid what happened during the League of Nations, where there wasn't such a formal hierarchy in terms of having a pentarchy that could enforce the law. So the initial idea was that the victors wouldn't share the spoils, because the spoils, decolonization was beginning in earnest. But the idea is that they were primarily responsible for preserving the status quo, international peace and security. When we talk about self-determination, domination, this is the language of the anti-colonial struggles of the Third World, and their primary block of support is in the United Nations General Assembly. So if we talk about statehood, to be a state, you don't need to be a member of the UN. The fact is that most states are today, but that hasn't historically always been the case. They're distinct. So the Palestinians, I think, have it's not perfect claim, they're not independent, but they have a strong claim based on the fact that I think almost 150 states recognize them as a state, to statehood. The problem is they don't have, in terms of becoming a full UN member, as you mentioned, the United States is blocking that in the Security Council because you need approval of that body. But what's happened is the General Assembly stepped in and have done everything that they're able to do to confer additional rights on the state of Palestine. So that it's almost as though it is a UN member state, has everything with the exception of the right to vote, the power of the right to vote.
How does Palestinian leadership complicate things? Because it has 2 governing structures or governing bodies, Hamas in one part and the Palestinian Authority in the other. Some places, some countries don't even recognize these as legitimate. Does that matter at all to this problem we're discussing?
Yes, of course it does. I mean, I would say it's the same structure, it's the same government, but you have 2 different political parties who claim to be the legitimate representatives. The fact that they are separated Hamas is not just in Gaza, right? They were governing because of the coup d'etat the attempted coup d'etat, the purported coup d'etat, and the dispute between Fatah and Hamas in 2000 after the legislative elections. I mean, I can go into a lot in detail into that in 2006. That Hamas basically kicked out the Palestinian Preventive Security Forces and took control, and then the Israelis.
I guess what I'm asking is, who would even represent the Palestinians as a state at the UN now, right?
Well, the UN is clear because it's a PLO, which is dominated by Fatah. But you're right to say that Hamas is also in the West Bank, and the Muslim Brothers are all over the Middle East. So, and there's a competition there. But on the bigger picture, they tend generally to agree.
Okay.
It's just on the who decides, who runs the place, of course, they don't agree on how they run it. They don't agree on.
Yeah. Asli Bali said the UN, in its architecture, prioritized the avoidance of a third world war over justice. She says that is part of the structure of international law itself. In other words, the Palestinians, in her view, have been denied justice because of the way the UN was set up.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly one way to view it. Preventing a third world war another way of preserving international peace and security, making sure that and the Third World War in this conception is a war between the great powers. I think Biden even referred to that. If it becomes a direct conflict between Russia and it almost is, and the US or US and China, then it becomes they're trying to prevent that because of the awesome power that these states, hard power and soft power.
And so they can't be dragged into a smaller conflict between two parties.
They could do that, and that's what happened during the Cold War. But that was seen as better than having a direct conflict between them. So they had these proxy wars instead, and then international law didn't do a very good job of regulating that kind of conflict, and so they had to develop new rules for that.
Yeah, over the years, the Palestinians, really the PLO, won a good deal of recognition at the UN. Observer status. In 1980, Austria gave the PLO full diplomatic recognition. And in 1969, the Palestinian cause was no longer viewed at the UN as simply a refugee problem by the General Assembly. It was now a political problem. And this goes to the recognition of Palestinians' rights to self-determination, inalienable rights that all peoples post-1945 are entitled to. But did this add up to anything, I guess is what I'm getting at. I keep returning to that question.
Well, it legitimized the Palestinian struggle, I suppose, having all these recognitions or being conferred observer. I mean, we mustn't forget that also in this period in the 1670s, the socialist bloc is very strong in the world. The Palestinian cause is seen as at that time was seen as a leftist, primarily as a leftist cause. There's armed struggle, revolution. That's the dominant kind of creed, if you like, at the time.
What do you think when you hear rules-based order?
I think that's Washington's idea of making sure everyone does what they say.
But there are rules, right? But we hear that all the time now, rules-based order. But it is selectively applied.
Of course. Yeah, this is a double standards issue of double standards. I mean, the worst one was the Trump administration recognizing the Golan Heights and Jerusalem as Israeli territory, and then going and saying to the Russians, the Crimea is, either you have a principle of no annexation by anybody, or you don't have it at all. And it seems to me they weakened that norm, took a serious knock when two UN Security Council members, Russia and the Americans, basically set it aside.
Is it correct to say the occupied territories are colonized by Israel, or is that just activist speak?
They're colonized in the sense that they build settlements for the exclusive use of one community in territory over which they have no lawful sovereign title to.
Yeah, so the law, international law, even some, I think, Israeli law, says the settlements in the West Bank are illegal. But here we are. Yeah. They're getting larger rather than smaller, the number.
Yeah, again, it's the enforcement, right? It's the enforcement that always fails. So the law is clear. We have clear judgments from the principal judicial organ of the United Nations and from other bodies setting out what the law is. We have even Israeli lawyers have told the government that even in 1967, the problem is the lack of enforcement of the law that has allowed the Israelis to continue building and populating the settlements with their own citizens.
So how would the law be enforced in this matter?
Well, it's sanctions.
UN would have to approve.
Nobody wants to talk about sanctions.
At the UN Security Council, they would be vetoed, right?
It would be vetoed. You could do it. I mean, the states increasingly act unilaterally, but economic and political power is still not exclusively, but mostly Western. I mean, power is shifting to the East, but even there, they're not imposing sanctions. And no one seems to be, apart from Turkey, I think, imposing trade sanctions or sanctions, even on military hardware. And until you have sanctions, or the EU hasn't withdrawn their trade agreement, until you have heavy sanctions, states will continue to behave the way they always have. Sanctions might not work as well.
Yeah, that's true. Let me address the other side of this issue. Israel has said for a long time that the UN is biased against it. We've been talking here about how international law hasn't protected Palestinians, whether that's true or not. Israel has said the UN is biased, there's anti-Semitism. The UN did at one point say Zionism was a form of racism. I think that was lifted in 1991. Yes. Yeah. There have been a number of resolutions against Israel, more than like the rest of the world combined over a certain period of time.
I don't buy that argument, but certainly because of the change of UN, if you look at the United Nations when Israel was established, if you look at its membership, it was mostly Western European states who ideologically were more sympathetic to the creation and support of a Jewish state. But as that changed over time, the Cold War, so you mentioned the Zionism is Racism Resolution, that was a Soviet project. You then had the Soviet alignment was the Third World, it became the majority, and they were far more critical of Israeli policy, particularly after 1967, and they saw what Israel was doing in the occupied territories as colonialism, the kind of project that they were fighting themselves at the time. There is a difference in ideology between support for the Palestinians have more support at the UN, again, because of that, and because also Arab states and the OIC are much larger bloc.
Another important element of international law is the prosecution of war crimes. Most war crimes prosecution in recent decades have dealt with tin pot dictators in sub-Saharan Africa. When it comes to Israel's leadership, they've also been accused of war crimes. To some people, that in and of itself is important to have that happen.
Yeah, but I was going to explain that. What will happen next is if it's approved by the pre-trial chamber, the rest, if they accept the evidence, they will issue these warrants. They'll go out on Interpol, be a red notice, and then all states, it's like more states are members of Interpol than are members of the UN, will be obliged, if they are members of the International Criminal Court, 124 members, to arrest, prosecute, or transfer to The Hague any of those individuals that enter their territory or their jurisdiction. And I think it's a bigger problem for the Israelis because the Hamas leaders, let's face it, they don't travel much. They've been avoiding, to the extent that these people travel, they've been avoiding the Western capitals. But they're on terrorism lists. They've got used to that way of avoiding being arrested. But the Israelis, on the other hand, they're useful to being welcomed in European capitals and other places. And so this is going to be a big problem for Netanyahu and the defense minister.
So we can wrap up with this when it comes to the difficulty of prosecuting war crimes, getting a conviction. Dirk Moses has talked about another problem with this constellation of forces, and that is the notion of permanent security. States do have a right to self-defense. In Dirk's interpretation, or in his argument, the rules are written in a way to allow states a lot of leeway when it comes to defending their people, defending their territory, up to and including what some people consider the commission of war crimes or just massive use of violence, state violence, to defend themselves and their interests, where maybe nothing is actually done illegally. The rules allow for the legal perpetration of massive amounts of violence. Do you have any thoughts on this as it pertains to the conflict in Gaza today?
Yeah, so this is the issue that's actually before the International Court of Justice, where one side is claiming that Israel's actions amount to genocide, and the other side is claiming, no, what we're doing is in perfect conformity with a few mistakes here and there, but is otherwise in conformity with international humanitarian law. I mean, Dirk's argument, if it's about self-defense, is connected, but all states have an inherent right of self-defense. Now, legally, that is subject to limitations of necessity and proportionality, but as we've seen since 9/11, if not before then, states routinely abuse, I would say, this right to commit all kinds of violence under the so-called right of self-defense anywhere in the world. This is the Bush doctrine I'm referring to and others. And Israelis have their own concept. So it is true that states do employ this term, do employ security. An international humanitarian law, which is a different body of law to the law of self-defense, does allow for civilian deaths in terms of proportionality assessments and the like, if they're incidental. But it doesn't mean that they can kill as many civilians as they like. The difficulty is, let's say they say we're going to strike a building and we claim that it's, that the Hamas leadership is there, and in the process, we kill civilians. So that would be considered, depending on how many civilians die and the context and what weapons were used, there's an argument that such a strike would be considered lawful. Because of that, it can be abused, because there is no hard rule about how many civilians can be killed to destroy a military objective, a military target. And that's the problem. And that's where the language can be used to commit horrible atrocities, which is what we're seeing in the Gaza Strip.
I guess I garbled Dirk's argument a little bit. I'll clarify it here, reading from an essay he wrote. And he was on my podcast to explain this. I'll share a link to that when I put out my newsletter this week. He calls permanent security extreme responses by states to security threats enacted in the name of self-defense. Permanent security actions target entire civilian populations under the logic of ensuring that terrorists and insurgents can never again, represent a threat, never being the important word there. It is a project, in other words, that seeks to avert future threats by anticipating them today. So if you have to eliminate even the tiniest possibility of a threat coming your way, well, think of all the violence you have to then, right, engage or apply to make that happen.
So this is where I might differ from Dirk. I'd say it's an accurate formulation of what some states do, but I would say it's not lawful to act. Well, you could say I want to get into all into the arguments about anticipatory self-defense, but generally any use of force that is done before an armed attack is very difficult to justify under international law. So a state attacking someone because of a threat or a perceived threat is not lawful. You have to show that there's an imminent attack or threat of attack or an actual attack. You can't just go and strike someone. But this is where the line's blurred, yes.
But the Palestinian people's right to self-determination, their right to justice, must also be recognized. And put yourself in their shoes. Look at the world through their eyes. It is not fair that a Palestinian child cannot grow up in a state of their own. Living their entire lives with the presence of a foreign army that controls the movements, not just of those young people, but their parents, their grandparents, every single day. It's not just when settler violence against Palestinians goes unpunished. It's not right to prevent Palestinians from farming their lands or restricting a student's ability to move around the West Bank or displace Palestinian families from their homes. Neither occupation nor expulsion is the answer.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, the Cold War was a conflict between two irreconcilable systems: democratic capitalism in the West, Marxism-Leninism in the East, the Soviet Union and China. But how much did that ideology motivate Soviet foreign policy? I mean, we took it as an article of faith that the Soviet Union was trying to spread communism all over the world. Well, a new book has some provocative arguments to make about that. And those arguments can be applied to today's crisis in Eastern Europe, because understanding motivations is always critical. That is next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.
Okay, it's official. We are very much in the final sprint to Election Day. And face it, between debates, polling releases, even court appearances, it can feel exhausting, even impossible to keep up with. I'm Brad Milkey. I'm the host of Start Here, the daily podcast from ABC News. And every morning, my team and I get you caught up on the day's news in a quick, straightforward way that's easy to understand, with just enough context so you can listen, get it, and go on with your day. So, kickstart your morning. Start smart with Start Here and ABC News, because staying informed shouldn't feel overwhelming.